Hey, this is Pastor Dustin Neely of Crossing Church in Louisville, Kentucky, and I wanted to take just a moment today to record some of these short videos that deal with some of the questions that I left hanging in our recent sermon on creation from our Big Story series. I'll be using the content from my friend Mark Driscoll's book here called Doctrine, and if you'd like to read this all in detail, I would certainly commend that book to you, or even follow the link that I'll include here where you can hear his teaching on this subject as well. But the first thing I want to deal with is the question, what are the various views of Christian creation? Now, of course, there's the naturalistic evolution view that does not believe in a creator God, and so it has science that they've come up with to back up their view. But in the Christian community, with people who love God and believe the Bible, what are basically the big ideas and the teams that line up behind them? That's what we want to talk about in this video. The first one is kind of the umbrella idea of what we would call historic creationism. This is God created the earth, and we take this unknowing exactly how He did it, understanding that the Hebrew word there in Genesis 1:1 for beginning is actually the Hebrew word reshit, which means there's a starting point and there are things to come afterward. And so that allows for the possibility of a young earth or an old earth. Young earth meaning that the earth is probably, 10,000 or so years old based on the genealogies and those kind of thinking. And then the old earth position saying that for whatever reason, maybe we understand it, maybe we don't, but the earth is probably millions of years old, but God still created it. So this is kind of the overall arching term for all of those views, historic creationism. And then when you get past that, you get into the other views. And so the next one would be young earth creationism. And in this view, God created the entire universe, no question there. He did so in 6 literal 24-hour days. And this view seeks to be as biblical as it can and as faithful to the text as it can. And then it interprets all scientific data that we have today in light of what we have in the Scripture. So that's another strength. And its difficulty would be, as some suggest, that the creation of the sun and moon happens on day 4, but there appears to be evening and morning on the first 3 days. So if that's the view that folks hold, then they have to figure out exactly how that figures into the equation. So that is young earth creationism. Now, the next view is something called the gap theory. And so what happens here, God is the creator, and this offers that the first creation happened probably billions of years ago, as some scientists would suggest. Then some kind of catastrophic event came along. People offered that this would probably be the fall of Satan from heaven, and it left the earth in a destroyed condition like we pick up with in Genesis 1:2. So God responds to this disaster and recreates the earth, if you will, a few thousand years later in 6 literal days, and then repopulates the earth as we have recorded in Genesis 1:3 to 27. So according to this view, the earth is old from the first creation, but mankind is young because of the recent recreation. So the problems with this view are that nothing in the Bible speaks of 2 creations, and then also you have to deal with the fact that God declared everything that He made as very good, and that seems to not correlate with the fact that their world would have been very bad and therefore needed to be recreated. So some difficulties there if you hold to the gap theory. Next is something called the literary framework view. Now in this view, God is still the creator, still in good shape there, but folks read this that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are intended to be read not as literal, but as figurative language. So the 6 days that are listed in Genesis 1 are to be interpreted metaphorically and not as literally 24-hour days. So the framework that is outlined there goes like this. Day 1 is forming. Light and darkness are separated. Day 2, sky and waters are separated. Day 3, dry land and waters are separated. And then plants and trees. So forming on day 1 through 3, and then filling on day 4, sun and moon and stars, lights in heaven. Day 5, fish and birds. Day 6, animals and man. So that's what the literary folks think. And the difficulties here is that even when God uses figurative language in the Bible, it is still used to communicate a literal truth. So this seems to be referring to the use of figurative language in a way that other parts of the Bible do not. Now, view 5 is something called the day-age view. And in this view, God created the universe, and that includes Adam and Eve, but he did so in 6 sequential periods of time that are geological ages and not literal 24-hour days. So the biggest problem with this view is that these 6 days are not in the same order as held by old earth science. For example, the sun appears on day 4. Another problem with this view is that the 6 days of creation seem to clearly be literal days, which is a position that I hold and will explain in just a moment. View 6 is also something called theistic evolution. In our day, in kind of a more modern world, people have really tried hard to come along with alongside what science has offered as reality, and so they've tried to make evolution work alongside of biblical creationism. And so the view here is that most of evolutionary's hypothesis is accepted, with the difference that God is the starting point. So on the surface, this may sound like, oh, this is the answer, but there are problems with this view as well. First, it inherits all of scientific's impossibilities and it incorporates them as actual truth. Things like gaps in the fossil record, so on and so forth. Also, that what you have in evolution is folks who believe that certain species become other species. Now, we'll do another video and talk about the different kinds of evolution, because that word is not synonymous across the board. But what you see in Genesis 1 is that each species had a species of its own. The language that's used there is according to its kind when it talks about its offspring. So there's a problem there with the text. And then third, it seems that the rest of Scripture portrays God as continually involved with the details of creation, including making grass, feeding birds, feeding other creatures. But some kind of theistic evolution seems to have God almost in a deistic position, that he kind of set things going and then he went to get a taco. Who knows what he was doing? But he was not intimately involved. So theistic evolution, though popular, seems to have some problems as well. Now, my personal view, at this point in my life, at the ripe old age of 33, I think I probably fall either with a historic creationism or a young earth creationism. Let me unpack why I stand where I stand. Basically, my understanding is that you got to go with the Bible, so we got to go with what it says. And what it says in verse 1 does seem to allow for old earth or for young earth, because that Hebrew word does mean kind of an indisclosed, or undisclosed rather, amount of time. So we got to deal with the text for what it says, and then we can go from there. The things that make me nervous about holding an old earth creation is the idea that how this plays out is that basically God would have created the world, and it would have been formless and void, kind of an uninhabited desert wasteland, if you will. And then it would have sat for millions of years while this unfolded. And then suddenly God takes a wild hair, it appears, and comes on and begins to create. So I have no problem assuming that humanity is young, 10,000 year kind of thing right there based on the genealogies. But the fact of the earth just sitting around forever and ever, and then God decides to create it, is problematic to me. I mean, it's allowable based on the text in my view, but it just doesn't seem as reasonable to me. So I would probably hold more of a view like this, that God created the earth, and one of two things happened with, for example, the Grand Canyon. Well, why does it look so old if it's this way? Well, when God created Adam, what it appears in the text is that he created him fully mature. Adam didn't come on the scene as a zygote, and then he grows from a zygote into a man. He seemed to be he was created fully mature, it appears. So I think one of two things happened that probably puts us more leaning toward a young earth position. And that is that God created the earth mature. So it didn't come this way, and so it was created mature. It just looks really old. Okay? The second thing could be that the flood that came through creates things like the Grand Canyon, and even though it's relatively young, it looks very old. So with any of these positions, there are certain concessions that you have to make, and you have to say, you know what, that's why this is an open-handed issue. The closed hand is God created all this. He is the author, the sustainer of life. We believe the Bible. All those things are in the closed hand. But exactly on how this lays out, then we can have some diversity. And that's why some people in our church would be historic creationists who could say, hey, I could see it either way. You'll have young earth creationists who would say, hey, I believe that it's this, and I believe that it's 10,000 years old, and here's all these things under that. You'll have old earth creationists, hey, I believe all that, but I believe the earth is old. Maybe they believe that it sat there for a while. Maybe they have other reasons that filter into why they think the earth is old. And those are the kinds of things that make it an open-handed issue. But that's where I personally lean at this point as a historic creationist who's open to either, or probably a young earth creationist who thinks that the earth is young. So in my next video, we will be answering the question, what about these days? Are they 6 literal 24-hour days? Tune in and we'll talk about it.